It's actually a very brilliant system, which you're probably familiar with, or those of you who go to business school, people study this all the time. You keep very tight inventories. And a lot of people mistakenly thought that that's the success of the system, is that you minimize your inventory costs. But in fact, what happens is you have a production process in which every individual worker is empowered to stop the output of the entire factory if they see a problem in the production process. So that you're an assembly line worker, you see a car coming down the assembly line, you get a door from a supplier, you see that it doesn't fit properly. In a traditional Taylorite factory, you just put the door on anyway, and you pound it in there, and you hope that the customer is not going to notice. And a lot of the quality control problems that Detroit experienced, the old Detroit experience, was precisely because of this kind of behavior. There's no incentive to actually fix the problem. In Toyota, they invented this famous cord that you could pull, and if you saw a problem in the production process, you pulled the cord, the entire factory would shut down, and not a single car would come off the assembly line until you had fixed that particular problem, all right? And what that is, if you think about it, is an extraordinarily high-trust system, because what you are doing is you are empowering your hourly workers, your lowest workers in the hierarchy, with the ability to stop the production of the entire assembly line. And under those conditions, if there's an angry worker or a worker that feels that the union has been disrespected, they can bring the entire production line to a halt, and therefore you're delegating a tremendous amount of power to your most humble workers. So obviously this kind of a system is not going to work without social capital, all right? Another trend that picked up steam in the 1990s and is still very much with us is the virtualization or the outsourcing of products and companies. So you had classic vertically integrated companies in which you did everything from mining iron ore to producing steel to making automobiles to then marketing the automobiles, all within the boundaries of a single company. Why did you do this? The classical economic theory about this is that it reduces transaction costs, because if you outsourced, you couldn't trust the people to whom you were outsourcing. But we've now moved to a different kind of system in which different functions are given to suppliers, to contract manufacturers that can actually perform critical steps in the production process, including things like manufacturing. There are some semiconductor manufacturers in Silicon Valley that actually do not have their own fabrication facilities. They contract out to other companies to actually do the manufacturing for them. All they are basically design and marketing companies, all right? Now, this kind of a system, like the flattening of an organization, is also something that requires a great deal of trust, because if you do not have trust between yourself and your suppliers or between the partners that are outside your organization, which you cannot control, it's going to be very difficult to make this kind of a system work, all right? The third form of organization is even more radically decentralized. It's a network in which there's no chief, there's no CEO, there's no sovereign source of authority, in which the cooperation is really spontaneous and it's based on a peer-to-peer kind of system. A lot of the internet is of this sort. People have argued that the rise of the internet and of many-to-many communications facilitates precisely this form of organization. Actually, it's often the case that responsibility, it's not that there's no hierarchy, there's no single point of hierarchy. And so you have the alliances of different kinds of organizations at various different levels in which there's no clear source of direction, all right? So what is the meaning of this shift to these forms of alternative organization away from traditional hierarchy and traditional Taylorism? Well, I think that this is an indication of the necessity of social capital functioning for formal control, all right? The big problem in any modern economy is what Friedrich Hayek, the great economist, the great Austrian economist, identified as the problem of local knowledge. If you are an assembly line worker and you're assembling a car and you see that there's a problem, that the door panel doesn't fit, you're the one that knows that. It's not a vice president up in a glass tower at corporate headquarters that knows that. It's you, the worker. And unless you empower that worker to act on that local knowledge, you are not going to fix the quality problem that you are building into the car. Hayek argued that this is why socialism itself doesn't work. Socialism was based on a high degree of centralization. It wasn't just one company that was organized hierarchically. It was the entire Soviet economy that was controlled from Moscow. There was a physical allocation of inputs and outputs. There was one bureau, one agency in Moscow that set all prices in the Soviet Union. Now, if you think about how this works in a modern economy, you understand why socialism collapsed. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the most complex industrial product would probably have been something like an automobile or a truck that maybe had a few thousand different parts that you needed to assemble. A modern airliner like the 787 that Boeing someday will deliver has on the order of 4 or 5 million different parts. And if you have to have a centralized hierarchy that sets the price of every one of those 4 million parts, it's never going to work. It's simply never going to work. And that is why decentralized markets are much more efficient as allocators of scarce resources than any kind of centralized hierarchy. And so Hayek, back in the 1940s, argued that socialism is going to collapse because it does not take advantage of local knowledge. So how do you take advantage of local knowledge? You have to empower people at the lower parts of the hierarchy. Monitoring and control is what hierarchies do. They try to say, okay, what are you producing? If you're not producing enough, I'm not going to pay you. And you establish this elaborate system basically of spying on your workers and forcing them by very crude economic incentives to behave. What social capital does is to shift the burden of monitoring and accountability and to make it an internal one. That is to say, to make it something that each worker carries around with them as part of their training, so that that Toyota worker feels an obligation to the company as a whole. He or she wants the output of the company to be maximized, and therefore is going to take the responsibility to pull that cord only when they see a serious problem in the production process, and not casually. And again, this emphasizes the need for trust within the organization. General Motors, when it tried to implement this Toyota system in its factories in North America during the 1990s, did not understand that social capital was critical to making this system work. They thought this was just a good way of controlling inventories. They took a very hard line towards their labor unions. They tried to force them to give up wages and benefits as cost-cutting measures. And the workers reacted to this by saying, well, if you're going to treat us that way, we're not going to play ball with you. And the entire company, all of GM's North American operations, were shut down on 2 separate occasions because, having implemented this big Japanese system where every part has to get to someplace else in North America within 48 hours, otherwise the system shuts down, they were subject to strikes by a local union in one part of Ohio in one of the strikes that then disabled the whole rest of the company. So there was no trust within General Motors. This is something that the companies like Ford that understood the importance of trust within an industrial organization, it was a lesson that they properly learned from Japan. It was not a matter of inventory control. It was a matter of trusting and empowering workers and allowing those with local knowledge that could actually understand the production process and could contribute to it. It gave them the power to actually do that. And so it was very much a part of a broad delegation of of responsibility within organizations. And I think that every modern organization has been moving in this direction towards greater trust and away from traditional rewards and punishments, monitoring and sanctions as a way of controlling their workers. Now, why is all of this happening? I think that, as I have explained, Hayek's whole theory about local knowledge, as an economy becomes technologically more complex, it is inevitable that you are going to need to trust workers to have the skills and abilities to make decisions on their own, rather than treating them simply as agents that carry out the boss's orders. And this is why in a post-industrial economy, you're seeing this kind of shift to greater delegation of responsibility, both in the generation of products and in the production process. And I promised you that we were going to get back to the theme of education, and this is where education comes in, because you cannot implement a high-trust industrial system in a society with very poorly educated workers. In the Ford factory in the year 1915 in Michigan, in Highland Park, Michigan, 50% of the hourly workers, the blue-collar workers in that plant, could not speak English because they were first-generation immigrants to the United States. Most of them didn't have more than a third or fourth grade education. And therefore, the only way that you could organize them and to get them to do a highly complex process was to treat them like they were machines. The managers couldn't even communicate in the same language with their workers. Now, you compare that to an organization like Google or Microsoft or Intel, in which the hourly workers, the equivalent of the hourly workers, are actually PhD electrical engineers. And it's obvious that in that kind of an industrial setting, you are not going to have the same kinds of opportunities for control, because most of your workforce actually knows more about what they're doing and can monitor their own production better than their bosses can. If you're a software engineer, it's not your manager that's going to tell you whether you're writing good code or not. You are the one that's going to know it. And unless you can control your own output through internalized norms, shared norms that are shared across the organization, that organization is not going to produce a better product. What's happening in a modern economy? We're all moving into complex services. Architects, lawyers, doctors, university professors, software engineers, all of these people do complex activities, they produce complex services, and these services are extremely difficult to monitor through the classic techniques of Taylorism. And therefore, unless there is an internal set of values that is inculcated into that workforce by which people hold themselves to certain standards of performance, you cannot make a post-industrial economy work.